I honour the first Australians on whose land we meet and whose cultures we celebrate as the oldest continuing cultures in human history. I honour the stolen generations whose mistreatment over nearly a century represents a continuing stain on the national soul, and to whom the national apology was given. Just as I honour my Indigenous brothers and sisters who have chosen to be with us here today, and I honour in particular those from the Kinchela Boys' Home, from the Cootamundra Girls' Home, from the Parramatta Girls' Home, and all others who have honoured us with their presence here today. I'd also acknowledge Uncle Alan Madden, Uncle Lester Marr, Clark Donovan, Clark Kent over there. Only remarkable stories. The stories are important. Thank you for telling them. They are part of our living history, and they're part of our future. Thank you for telling them, because these stories are often deeply painful. Also to Vic Dominello, thank you for hosting us here in these modest digs here at the New South Wales Parliament. And it's good of you. It's bigger space and better space than where we've been at the Vice-Regal residence in recent years, so thank you. Philip Ruddock, representing the Prime Minister. Good to see you here, Philip. Alan Tudge here as well. Also, where's my good friend Ken Wyatt? Where are you sitting, Ken? Lost you? Good to see you here, Ken, and thank you for your work on the question of constitutional recognition. I acknowledge that and wish you well in what is a difficult task. I'm also told we have here Maurice Payne. I'm not sure if Maurice is here. I know we've got Bruce Baird. Good to see you there, Bruce. Fellow member of the board of the National Apology Foundation. Thank you for your presence. Richard Miles, Jenny Macklin, Guy Zangari, Michael McLeod. Michael, where are you? You've changed places. Well done. Thank you, mate. And Jeff McMullen, whose dulcet tones greet us here each year. Thank you very much. As I said before, my fellow board members of the National Apology Foundation, as well as the many representatives of corporate Australia, I would just like to say something strongly supportive of our corporate representatives here today. So many of you are making the difference. I was just talking to Commonwealth Bank, who not only host us here this morning, but who have several hundred Indigenous employees. Thank you, Commonwealth Bank. But not just them as well. I was speaking to a gentleman out here. Your company name is? Sorry? Compass Group, 500 Indigenous employees. Well done. Anyone else here in corporate land who I should acknowledge? Got a story to tell? You've got 15 seconds, 14, 13, 12. But thank you. As I've said here before, you guys and girls make the difference. You actually create jobs. Sustainable jobs. And I really acknowledge the work you do, given the difficulties we have as reflected in the current Closing the Gap report in the challenge of employment for our Indigenous young people. And also, if I could acknowledge, where's Andrew Penfold? Where are you, Andrew? I've lost you. Okay, sitting discreetly up the back. It's unlike you to be discreetly up the back. For the extraordinary work that you are doing, now with some 600 kids from Indigenous communities around New South Wales and around Australia in the best schools in the country through the work of your foundation. I'm pleased to have written you a $20 million cheque however long ago. I'm even more pleased to see it's having been used wisely and changing lives all on the way through. And for those of you from corporate land who have partnered with that foundation, thank you for again being in the transformation process. It is an honour to be among you all. Politics can be an ugly business. Politics without purpose, even more decisively so. But when these two propositions combine, that is politics and purpose, we can, just occasionally, surprise ourselves with the good that we can create together and even sustain together. 7 years ago today, as the first parliamentary act of my government, we surprised ourselves as a nation when together, government and opposition, finally resolved that the time had finally come formally to apologise to the first Australians for centuries of unbridled abuse. And 7 years ago, we, the Parliament, also resolved that for this apology to be anything more than a symbol, that we should also agree together that we should commit ourselves to closing the yawning gap between the lives and livelihoods of Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. It is a minor miracle that 7 years later, despite the ebbs and flows of this ugly business called politics, that this framework, this closing the gap framework, for organising our efforts, for analysing our successes and understanding our more numerous failures, remains intact. Most other things fall victim to the mindless vicissitudes of what passes for our national political life. Yet this framework and the numerical measures contained within it has not. We anchored it in the formal intergovernmental agreement of the Commonwealth and the states and territories in the meeting of the Council of the Australian Governments that I convened specifically for that purpose in Darwin in 2008. And so government and opposition, the Commonwealth and the states, Labor and Conservative, we all agreed to subject ourselves to the hard yardstick of closing the gap within a generation. And it's against this yardstick, the truth is, our achievements have been meagre. I'm glad nonetheless that the yardstick remains to keep us honest about where we succeed and where we fail. Very simply, the purpose of the apology that I delivered 7 years ago to Indigenous Australians was not to provide a fleeting national feel-good moment. The purpose of the apology and the national strategy of closing the gap that accompanied it was to unite the nation, to harness our collective energies, to break the cycle of Indigenous disadvantage for the future. As the Prime Minister who delivered that apology, what worries me 7 years on is whether the spirit of reconciliation remains as fresh today as it was then, whether governments across the nation are sustaining or reducing their financial effort, because this is essential to the task, particularly in remote and regional Australia. And whether we are sustaining sufficiently the spirit of national political bipartisanship and unity that we had at that time as well. Because if we are not on any of those measures, the message to all of us whitefellas in the room is very simple. From our Aboriginal brothers and sisters, they would be simply saying to us, get back to it and get on with it. That's it. Numbers, real numbers, can be a troubling thing. I don't just mean in party rooms. I mean numbers, in accounts. They hold us to account. They separate the high rhetoric from the base reality. And that's why they are important. Everyone and anybody can produce an anecdote, whether to advance a particular prejudice or else to confront it. But very few of us, and usually it's left to governments alone, can produce the comprehensive data that tells us whether we are succeeding or failing in closing the gap, or whether we're just standing still. The data is precious. It's taken years to assemble this data. Because when I was elected Prime Minister, very little data existed at all. That's the truth of it. So we had very little choice but to begin collecting, collating and publishing virtually from scratch. It seemed that we as Australians had become so embarrassed by the scope of Indigenous disadvantage that we just didn't want to know, or perhaps we didn't want the world to know. So my first challenge to our Parliament today on this 7th anniversary of the apology is very simple. Do not allow the withdrawal of any resources necessary for the proper collection of the data we need for a generation still to come, if we are to map our progress with precision and, where necessary, our regress in closing the gap. We need not just to keep the data we have, we need better data than we've got. That's because policy and programs need to be guided on the core question of what works and what doesn't work by the data, not by just some gut instinct dreamt up one evening in the members' bar. Otherwise, precious public funds will be spent on programs for which the evidence is thin or non-existent. I believe it's the grossest form of false economy to refuse to spend $1 million on data before spending $1 billion on a program. And let's be clear, this year's Productivity Commission report and earlier reports by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare are absolutely clear about where the data continues to be deficient. This year's Closing the Gap report is a sobering document, as is the report released by the Close the Gap Campaign Steering Committee, co-chaired by Kirsty Parker and Mick Gooder. Both reports should be read carefully by policy leaders across the nation. Together, they document modest success and many failures. At best, we've been presented with a mixed picture, with some success in infant mortality rates and Year 12 attainments, insufficient gains in life expectancy, and major problems still apparent in early childhood and primary education and employment. The National Steering Committee report on Closing the Gap contains more sobering data in the health profile of Indigenous men and women, with particular emphasis on diabetes, 3 times the rate of non-Indigenous Australians, and kidney disease, 2 times the rate. In all these areas, policy must continue to be adjusted in response to the data, if closing the gap is to become more than a permanent depressing yardstick of policy failure. There are other areas of Indigenous data which are currently not sufficiently emphasised in the debate on closing the gap. And that is the explosion in Indigenous incarceration rates. Australia is now facing an Indigenous incarceration epidemic. And this in turn is negatively impacting various other closing the gap targets. Consider the following. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians make up only 2.3% of the adult population. They make up 27.4% of the adult prison population. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander adults were imprisoned at 13 times the rate of non-Indigenous adults. Since 2000, the imprisonment rate for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander adults increased 57%, while the non-Indigenous rate has remained constant. The rate of imprisonment for Indigenous men is more than 10 times the rate for Indigenous women. But the female imprisonment rate is growing rapidly, with a 73.7% increase since the year 2000. Odds are, if any Indigenous person is released from prison, they are more likely to re-enter prison than an Indigenous child is to finish school. These are alarming developments. Indigenous women in particular are critical to the future strength of Indigenous families and their communities. They play an important role in the care of children, providing the future generation with the possibility of a stable upbringing. Continued growth in the number of Indigenous women in prison will have a long-lasting and negative impact on the well-being of Indigenous families and communities. One of the contributing factors to all this is the operation of the bail laws of the states and territories. Indigenous young people are 23 times more likely than non-Indigenous young people to be on remand. In WA, 45% of Indigenous juveniles in custody have not yet been sentenced, 45%. In New South Wales, the rate of juveniles on remand who will not receive a custodial sentence is as high as 84%. The single biggest factor in this is the physical and financial inability to comply with bail conditions, including the lack of appropriate accommodation available to young offenders whilst they are still awaiting sentencing. We are seeing the emergence of this new crisis in Indigenous Australia beyond anything we have seen before. It's a subject of escalating anxiety in Indigenous communities across Australia. It is raised with me all the time when I meet Indigenous leaders. This is so much top of mind. It is alive in every community as an active and real concern, because they see their young people slipping away and sliding into prison in greater numbers than has ever occurred before. For this reason, I argue we now need a further closing the gap target on reducing Indigenous incarceration rates. The current trend will continue to be destructive for Indigenous families and communities nationwide, just as it will become prohibitive for the Australian taxpayer. There must be a better way. Just as Mick Gooder has said, as a society, we do better at keeping Aboriginal people in prison than we do at keeping them at school or university. These are hard things to say. They often don't feature a lot in our public discourse. They need to feature more. This is such a huge number of kids. Another emerging, difficult and disturbing and partly related set of data is the rapidly growing number of Indigenous children being removed from their families. This has been the subject of some discussion here already this morning. This is a complex and difficult area because our laws rightly attach the first priority to the protection of the child over any other consideration. The horrific events in Cairns in recent times reminds us of this more than ever, of the importance of communities reaching out to those in need, reminding us afresh of the deep wisdom that indeed it does take a village to raise a child. The data on the removal of children is now dramatic. While comprising only 5% of the national child population, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children make up 34% of all children placed in out-of-home care. In 2008, when I delivered the apology, 5,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids were in out-of-home care. 7 years later, this has risen dramatically to more than 13,900 as of 2013. 7 years ago, 5,000 Indigenous kids in out-of-home care, now nearly 14,000 Indigenous kids in out-of-home care. This represents a massive increase in the rate of Indigenous children in out-of-home care since the 1998 release of the Bringing Them Home report, in fact a 400% increase since then. While child neglect and the safety of all Australian children, including Indigenous children, is paramount, Indigenous leaders argue that alternative caring arrangements for such children are not being worked out with extended families and clan groups, as they could and in their argument should be. State and territory jurisdictions have primary responsibility in this area, but funding for community-based services appears in a number of jurisdictions to be dwindling. Professionals from within this sector point to existing barriers to recruiting Indigenous people into the kinship care system. The current process of recruitment itself, remuneration that values Indigenous kinship carers at much less than foster carers, and the professional and material supports that currently makes caring for kids too difficult. These are what they cite as the reasons why alternative caring systems are not working as they were designed to. This is why an emerging number of Indigenous leaders are beginning to speak with growing urgency of a new, emerging, stolen generation. This is not a criticism of those who provide care. These are good people. But we must reflect on where this is going. This is such a large number and a large increase. It is not a challenge to whether we should put at first priority the care of children. That is a given. It is not a challenge to the goodness and good-heartedness of those foster parents who provide care. That also is a given. It's a challenge to whether we are working creatively enough and effectively enough with Indigenous leaders to find other forms of care within extended family and broader kinship groups. I worry where this heads over time. I worry where it heads over time. Because of the direct relationship between this and the exploding incarceration rates for Indigenous Australians, the separation of children from wider family and kinship groups at an unprecedented rate must also now be explicitly addressed within the Closing the Gap framework. The safety of the child must always come first. The question is, where are they better cared for and how is this best arranged? To conclude, in the midst of all this, it's sometimes easy to forget that there are still many, many great stories emerging across Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia. And many of them, as we've heard this morning, are in this very room. You see it in their faces. You hear it in the tales of pride from their families. You see it in the schools. The minister's reference before to the singing of the Australian National Anthem. in Indigenous and Indigenous language. You see it in our universities, where I now see a new bounce in the step of Indigenous young people across our various university campuses. The graduation of kids in medicine and law and the standard professions. This is great to see. And Andrew's program provides so much of a stepping stone towards all that happening, as do others like it across the country. We are seeing, as I said before, the graduation of our first Indigenous doctors, the growth of Indigenous businesses, so important, and the election of more Indigenous members to our parliaments, both Commonwealth and state. These are all stories of genuine inspiration that must always temper us at moments when we are tempted to despair. Sometimes I fear we unnecessarily polarise the national political debate between the exclusively, quote, welfare models of the past and the exclusively personal responsibility models advocated for the future. The truth is, this is becoming a sterile debate. We need a middle way. We need a flexible approach for the future, which embraces the idea of a safety net for all who need it, as well as the incentives necessary to obtain self-reliance. One without the other does not work. If we look at the Indigenous employment challenge, arguably the most serious of the Closing the Gap challenges identified in the 2015 report, we will not improve the employment participation rate by simply withdrawing funds from basic programs. Unemployed Indigenous Australians have individual needs. Like non-Indigenous Australians, the most effective way to find work is individual case management between the education system and the labour market, where at present so many just fall through the cracks. And all this costs money, government money. But the yield longer term is worth the effort as jobs are secured, benefits surrendered and families supported. Making welfare to work for Indigenous Australians is about tailoring the safety net to individual circumstances until such time as it's no longer needed. Second, national policy goals and measurement against these goals, as reflected in a national Closing the Gap strategy, are crucial. As I said before, the data keeps us honest. But local flexibility in the programs deployed in each of Australia's 1,000+ Indigenous communities is equally crucial. Each program should be held accountable for the results against the fixed set of measures that have been agreed. But we should also fully embrace a policy of allowing 100 flowers to bloom in the choice of what programs are most likely to work locally. Because in the dozens of communities I've travelled to over the years across this vast continent, each is unique. And third, let's add the tragedy of Indigenous incarceration to the formal list of Closing the Gap goals over time. If we fail to do so and to act effectively, this factor alone may undermine most of what we seek to achieve elsewhere. Finally, there are the stolen generations themselves. They are the core of this enterprise and reconciliation, and for many, their lives or those of their loved ones have simply been destroyed. So for them, let us be wary of repeating the errors of the past by creating what they fear might become a second stolen generation. I am proud of the apology to Indigenous Australians. I'm proud of the apology I delivered to our Aboriginal brothers and sisters. I'm proud that as a nation, we then agreed to close the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. I'm proud of the fact that we haven't shrunk from those measures that we have set for ourselves, even when they tell us that many of our efforts are floundering. And I'm proud that we added to the fabric of our national laws protecting the interests of Indigenous Australians when my government ratified the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, when those before me refused to do so. And I will be proud of that day when these, the first Australians, will finally achieve proper recognition in our Constitution, the legal charter of a Commonwealth of which we are all members, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. Friends, there is much, much work still to be done. The last thing our Indigenous brothers and sisters would want for us is for us to give up in despair. There's too much at stake for that to occur. For my part, this time last year, I said I was planning to establish the National Apology Foundation. We have done so. I now chair a board of 7 eminent Australians, all committed to the mission of sustaining the spirit of and the substance of the apology and the practicality of closing the gap. The majority of our board are Indigenous. We have met throughout the year. We have held roundtables with Indigenous leaders from across the country who support our Foundation's mission. We hope to raise funds to help ensure the data continues to be collected. We help to, in our own way, to close the gap, specifically in education, through the funds that we're able to raise in that area as well, and to help the ongoing practical challenges for the stolen generation themselves. I thank Pat Turner, Jackie Huggins, Bruce Baird, Charles Passy, Frank Brennan, Christina Fijo-King and Tim Goodwin for their commitment as members of our board. I thank KPMG and Herbert Smith Freehills for their generosity and assistance in establishing this foundation. I'm pleased the National Apology Foundation consumes about half the resources of my office as a former Prime Minister of Australia. That's as it should be. It will, I hope, be my own personal vehicle for making a contribution in the great task of full and final reconciliation of all the peoples that make up this great land of ours, Australia. So my friends, this morning as we gather here in Sydney, as we look down close by Farm Cove where the first European settlers arrived, a little more than a couple of hundred years ago, we're reminded physically of where all this began and the extraordinary national journey with so many sad and horrible chapters on the way through in terms of our relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. But my message today is, let us not give up hope. The National Apology was worth delivering. Closing the gap is worth adhering to. And we as people of conscience across this country of ours should kindle afresh the spirit of reconciliation, kindle afresh the political resolve to dedicate the funds necessary to drawing those gaps to a close, and once again to rekindle the spirit and the reality of national political unity that enables all this to be achieved. I thank you.